Thank you very much. I'm going to speak in English, and I apologize because I cannot speak Spanish or read it. I wish I could. It would be a lot easier. The first thing I would like to do, and I'm going to keep what I have to say as short as possible and then try to answer your question, is to go back to the Watergate story briefly. This was after Richard Nixon, the president, resigned and kind of went into seclusion and would not be interviewed. And David Frost, the British journalist you may be familiar with, did a series of interviews with Nixon on national television that received a lot of attention. It was kind of Richard Nixon's first post-resignation coming out. And he sat for hours, and these ran in sequence over the period of a week in 1977, I believe. During the course of the interviews, Frost asked Nixon, what do you think of Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward and their reporting on you? And Nixon, in typical fashion, leaned back and said, well, Bernstein and Woodward worked for a liberal newspaper, the Washington Post. They are liberals themselves, and what they write is trash. And he meant it, as he often meant what he said. I was watching this on television at home, and immediately the phone rang, and it was my mother calling from Florida. You all know that we, in journalism and I think in any profession, use our mothers as the best index of what real reality is. And my mother came on the line and I said, what did you think? And she said, oh, you know, I said, here's the former leader of the free world calling. Oh, and Nixon said not only did what we write, not only was that trash, but we were trash, personally. And he also meant that. And I said, what did you think of this? He said, no problem, I understand it's politics, you have to do what you do in journalism. But what's this about being a liberal? Mothers have a way of going to what the issue is. I want to talk real quickly about why and how I got into journalism, a question that frequently is asked people in this business. It's kind of interesting, and I learned a lesson about journalism. I think I learned my most important lesson about journalism before I became a journalist. I was in high school in the 1950s in a small town outside of Chicago, where my father was a prominent lawyer. I also had a job in my father's law office. I was the janitor. I went in and each night cleaned up and was paid, at that time, which was quite a bit of money for somebody in high school, $11.75 a week. My father talked about his cases. Some of his cases were in the newspaper. I started looking at the matters that he had spread out on his desk, quite natural curiosity of a young teenager. I then started looking at other files in his office. I soon, after I would get done cleaning up, started looking at the files of all the other lawyers in the law firm. Then I started going to the old disposed files that were up in the attic. I learned something very important. Here in the files were buried accounts of the divorces of my friend's parents, cases of embezzlement, tax evasion. The mayor of the town, this small town, had been caught having a sexual affair with the most notorious girl in my high school class. This was all covered up. It was never public. No one was arrested. No one was indicted. In fact, when the prosecutors in this small town found out about the affair, they sent the girl wearing a microphone to secretly tape record their encounters. There was a transcript of this in the old file. It was the first time I learned about the stark, haunting purity of a tape-recorded conversation. Overall, the contrast, the reality of life in this small town and the lives of many of the prominent people versus what was in the files versus what they said they were, versus what they pretended they were, was very vivid. And when I got into journalism, I kept thinking, what is in the files that we haven't seen? What is it we don't know? What is being concealed? I always think about that, the disposed in the old files. That often you learn about political events. Always you learn about people if you can get that sort of information. Which leads me to the topic I want to talk about, politicians and journalists. These two forces in any society. There's a basic problem that politicians and journalists have. That is, the journalist loves or should love the truth. The simple fact is that most politicians dislike or even hate and have contempt for the truth. The truth comes in unexpected ways and in unexpected times. For instance, to take something in the United States that's very recent, just this week, President Clinton's nominee to be the defense secretary or run the Defense Department in the United States, a man named Admiral Inman, somebody I know very well going back to his times when he worked in the CIA. Admiral Inman surprisingly withdrew from consideration for this office, just came and held a press conference for an hour saying he was leaving because essentially 3 newspaper columnists had written things that Inman didn't like. His point was that the United States, the press is digging too deeply, it is too critical, it is too probing of people in political life. When something like this happens, I always think it's too easy to learn the wrong lesson. In fact, the lesson of this decision by Admiral Inman to withdraw is that here is a man who showed great character weakness, somebody who couldn't take rather mild criticisms from 3 columnists, had left the stage, said it was too tough. I can't take it, and this is the man who is going to lead the greatest military in the world. 3 rubber band shots from 3 columnists took him out of action. What's interesting is the media missed the story. What's the story? Not the conduct of the news media. The story is, who was this man? How did he come so close to having so much power? How did he come so close to having a job where you have to be tough and decisive, where the hard decisions, of course, are going to be critical. The difficult decisions are ones where there are lots of arguments on the other side. We missed the story. So often, secrets are fundamental to government and to the personality of politicians. Government in the United States, certainly here in Mexico, is secretive. And in fact, I think history shows that secrets, by and large, for a democracy are dangerous. There is too much in the United States, and certainly here, important aspects of the public's business that are unnecessarily hidden. Journalists are working against this secrecy, always. The interesting thing is that journalists work in isolation, that we don't have any of the legal